This mini lecture in our series on Christianity in the early national period focuses on the Methodist Church, or the Methodist Episcopal Church, in the United States. Beginning with only 4 workers in 1771, the Methodist Church, a century later, had 3.5 million members. And some have said in the pre-Civil War period, the Methodist Church was the largest institution in the United States, other than the federal government itself. The story of the rise of Methodism in the early national period is first and foremost the story of Francis Asbury, who could be called the founder of American Methodism. Asbury was born in Birmingham, England, to parents who were themselves among early followers of John Wesley there. He was converted under the influence of Methodist preaching at the age of 13 and was already serving as a lay pastor in the Methodist movement at the age of 16. In 1771, at the age of 26, he volunteered to come to the colonies as a Methodist missionary, and very quickly he assumed leadership over the 4 Methodist workers already there. 2 of those workers had been sent earlier by Wesley, and 2 were folks working within the Methodist movement strictly on their own initiative. Asbury was immediately disturbed, apparently, that the few Methodist preachers already in the colonies were doing their work only in the area where they lived. He was convinced that faithfulness to the missionary task required preachers to travel. He inaugurated what has come to be called an itinerant ministry among Methodist workers. The idea was that Methodist preachers would travel from place to place, preaching the gospel and organizing converts into what were called classes for mutual support and accountability in the faith. Methodist preachers came to be called circuit riders as a result. They weren't assigned parishes, as in the Church of England model or even the congregational model, like the ministers of other denominations. Rather, they were assigned to circuits, or geographically dispersed Methodist preaching places, to which they would travel periodically. For decades, to be a Methodist preacher meant that one committed oneself to circuit riding, from Methodist gathering to Methodist gathering, often miles apart on the American frontier. It should be noted that Asbury practiced what he preached. Null says that he himself traveled 300,000 miles during his ministry in the United States, all that by horseback. There are various sites around Virginia where Asbury is known to have preached. 5 miles from my own house in Madison County is an old plantation house of Joshua Fry, a friend of Thomas Jefferson's, who was converted by Methodist preaching. He turned his ballroom into a Methodist preaching station, and Asbury preached there at least once. Today it's a country inn where people go for fine dining. Little do they know that in the 1770s they could have heard the booming voice of Francis Asbury calling them to repentance, faith, and holiness of life. In England, the Methodist movement led by John Wesley was a renewal movement within the Church of England. Wesley was a priest in the Church of England. Most of the preachers there, Methodist preachers there, were not priests. They were not ordained. They were lay preachers. The same was true in America, and the initial assumption was that the Methodist movement here would be a renewal movement and not a separate denomination. The assumption was that folks converted by Methodist preachers would go to a priest in the Church of England for baptism and for the Lord's Supper. Methodist lay preachers had no authority to administer the sacraments. Of course, on the American frontier, it wasn't always practical for Methodist converts to find Anglican priests, or any other for that matter. And in response to the situation, an early Methodist lay preacher, Robert Strawbridge, assumed authority for himself to administer the sacraments. Partly in response to this crisis in America, Wesley ordained Thomas Coke and sent him to America with a plan for organizing the work there under Wesley's authority as a separate denomination. Interestingly, according to William Warren Sweet's History of Methodism in Virginia, Coke was invited to preach at a Church of England or an Episcopal church in New York City, and felt guilty about not telling the priest there that he was actually in America to form the Methodist Church as a separate movement. At a conference in Baltimore around the Christmas season in 1784, the Methodists in the United States decided, not without disagreement, on their plan for organization. Coke ordained Asbury, and his conference authorized him as a general superintendent with authority to ordain in the American Methodist Church. In so doing, they rejected, in fact, Wesley's authority over the movement in America. It would not be wrong to see what they did as reflecting the revolutionary spirit of independence from England. Just as the Revolution had been motivated in part by a resistance to bishops from the Church of England coming to America, now after the Revolution, the Methodists here rejected Wesley's bishop-like authority from England. Interestingly, of course, Wesley himself had no official authority to ordain Coke, as he was no bishop in the Church of England. Indeed, Wesley's brother Charles disapproved of his brother taking that unprecedented and unauthorized move. The theology that undergirded Asbury's prolific preaching and the preaching of other Methodist circuit writers was fully Arminian and Wesleyan. As with all Protestants, the emphasis was on salvation by grace through faith, not through moral works or religious observances, as Protestants claimed Catholics taught. You will recall that what divided Calvinists from Arminians was the question of election or predestination. Emphasizing the activity of God in salvation as a dimension of God's general sovereignty, Calvinists said that even believers' faith was fully a work of God within them. Asbury, by contrast, along with others who embraced Arminian theology, emphasized that God's free grace was available to all and potentially effective in all. The assumption here is that every human being, no matter how perverse, no matter how corrupt, remains capable, despite sin, of responding in faith to the message of grace. The human will is free, or at least free enough, to be able to respond in faith. Why else would Asbury have foregone luxuries that might have been available to him as a parish pastor and traveled over 300,000 miles by horseback in all sorts of weather, often sleeping along the way in whatever quarters were available to him or even outdoors on the ground, except for his motivation, except for being motivated by the belief that every human being, including the crude backwoodsmen of the frontiers of the American West, was capable of responding in faith and gaining salvation. Arminians had a higher view of human nature than Calvinists. This higher view of human nature is also reflected in the distinctively Wesleyan or Methodist theme that Asbury embraced. This is the idea of sanctification or perfection. Wesley believed that salvation by grace through faith offered not simply the promise of justification, that is, the promise of being forgiven and counted as righteous by God, but also sanctification, that is, actually being renewed and transformed and made holy by God's grace. Indeed, Wesley taught that perfection was possible in this life as a gift of God's grace in the life of a faithfully cooperative believer. Asbury preached that throughout the nation. Finally, and this may be Asbury's own unique contribution, he taught the possibility and importance of intimacy with God and with other Christians. Null is worth quoting here. Asbury, he says, was also a particularly effective spokesman for a distinctly Wesleyan spirituality. This piety did not deny doctrine or repudiate the importance of church structures. Rather, it subordinated these matters to the higher goals of communing with Christ and with the faithful. The original Methodists opposed formality, sought what historian Gregory Schneider has called the mystery of intimacy, and insisted that outward behavior should match the inward conversion of the heart. Sentiments like these, expressed in distinctive hymns, were the heart of Methodist spirituality, combining the tenderest expressions of love and the most demanding standards of righteousness. Methodist piety, even more than Methodist organization, transformed the Christian landscape of early America. That's from page 172 and 173 in Null's History of Christianity in the United States and Canada. As we've heard, when Asbury came to America, there were 4 Methodist workers here with about 300 laypersons associated with the movement. By the time he died in 1816, there were 2,000 Methodist ministers and over 200,000 members of the Methodist Episcopal Church. That growth may not have happened without his leadership, his tireless effort, and the effectiveness of his preaching a demanding and yet hopeful understanding of the gospel. The organizational structure established by the Methodists under Asbury's leadership was, according to Mark Null, a kind of paradox, a mixing of both autocratic and democratic features. The plan for organization that Wesley had sent over would have given him and Asbury, as general superintendent, almost complete control over the movement. The traveling preachers gathered in Baltimore, reflecting the American spirit of democratic populism, would have nothing of that sort of autocracy. Since that time, the power of the Methodist bishops has been countered by the power of the annual conferences, which were originally made up of all the preachers, and for many decades now include an equal number of laity. Still, Methodist circuit riders were not, like their Baptist counterparts, independent operators. They were assigned to their circuits by the general superintendent, and they reported annually to their peers in the annual conference. Mutual support and accountability was a feature of Methodist organization. Even local converts were organized into what were called class meetings, where they each gave an account for the state of their souls on a regular basis to their peers. The Methodist general rules said that the purpose of the class meetings was to advise, reprove, comfort, or exhort, as occasion may require. In the 50 years after the Christmas conference, Methodist preachers fanned out across the United States in patterns that were carefully organized by the general superintendents or bishops and the conferences. No other church to this day, I think it is fair to say, was as comprehensive in its presence across the nation. After the early national period, during which Methodist class meetings were established across the South and into the Midwest, it was the conversion of the West, or the ever-expanding frontier, to which Methodist revivalists and others directed their attention. Peter Cartwright was one of the heroes of the Methodist expansion to the West. Like Asbury, he was a tireless circuit rider who preached nearly 15,000 sermons over the course of his career. He's most famous for his work in Indiana and Illinois, where he actually ran against Abraham Lincoln for a place in the U.S. Congress. In the 1830s, he visited Iowa and then considered the wilderness and began to dispatch Methodist missionaries there. Another hero of the Western missionary work among the Methodists was a man named Jason Lee, who in the 1830s had pushed all the way to the Willamette Valley in Oregon, where he established a mission to the Flathead Indians there. Lee was soon advocating the formation of new states in the Pacific Northwest in letters to Congress from his distant outpost. Galston and Schmidt write the following about Methodism's westward expansion. Methodist preachers, they write, moved out on post roads leading westward just as soon as such roads were laid out. And if they were too impatient to wait for road builders, Methodist parsons simply mounted their horses and made their own trails to where any tiny knots of settlers or isolated families might be found. Whether a church could be built and sustained was not as important as bringing the ministrations of evangelical Christianity to Americans on the move. But churches were built, and one measure of Methodist success is that this denomination by 1850 had more churches than any other group in such western lands as Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, Arkansas, Tennessee, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Iowa. Sidney Alstrom cites Methodist organizational genius as the first among 4 reasons for the flourishing of the Methodists. After this, he cites their acceptance and successful use of revival methods, including, of course, dramatic emotional preaching that demands a response, the anxious bench to which people were called to be prayed over as they sought conversion. With regard to the camp meeting, Galston and Schmidt report that Asbury claimed in 1811 that 3 to 4 million Americans were attending those extended revival meetings modeled after Cane Ridge. Also important, according to Alstrom, was their recruitment of preachers from among the common people. Unlike Episcopal, Congregational, and even Presbyterian clergy, Methodist preachers were not known at the beginning for their education, and there was little sense that becoming a preacher required much of an education. Being a Methodist preacher didn't require sound theological understanding of the creeds and liturgies of the church, but rather an ability to preach for conversion. Finally, Alstrom says that Wesleyan theology, which he described as Arminianism set on fire, helps to explain the Methodist explosion. In concluding these remarks about the rise of Methodism in the United States, it is important to recognize the degree to which the Second Great Awakening, like the first, helped to forge a truly national identity. Indeed, it probably did so much more powerfully than even the first did. H. Richard Niebuhr, a 20th century historian and theologian, has referred to the Second Great Awakening as our national conversion. A more contemporary church historian, G.C. Goyne, has explained Niebuhr's comment this way. He meant, of course, that not that the whole population was converted to evangelical Christianity, but that America's religious revivals transcended local and particular allegiances, stimulating and reinforcing a national self-consciousness. The awakening, in short, began the conversion of scattered and diverse colonists into one people with a common sense of nationhood. Goyne cites an interesting fact that displays the importance of evangelical Christianity and particularly the Methodist Church in the shaping of national identity in the early 19th century. In 1827, Goyne reports, 2 Methodist newspapers, one in South Carolina and another in New York, combined to form what was called the Christian Advocate and Journal. The next year, it reported a weekly circulation of 28,000 copies. By comparison, the London Times was reaching only 10,000 readers in 1835. Goyne says this means that the Methodist newspaper was, in fact, for several years, the world's largest newspaper. This is an illustration of the importance and influence of a church that exploded in size and strength because of its powerful message and its successful utilization of the revival methods of the Second Great Awakening. Next time, we'll look at another group that used revival methods successfully with a very different organizational structure, the Baptists.